In the spring of 53 before Christ, on the dusty plains east of the Euphrates River, an army of 40,000 Roman soldiers, the largest force Rome had ever sent against the Parthian Empire, marched into the desert under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus, who at that moment was the richest man in the known world and one of the three rulers of the Roman Republic, and within a single afternoon, that army was almost entirely destroyed by an enemy that fought in a way Rome had never seen before. Crassus died on the battlefield. His son Publius died trying to save him. 20,000 legionaries were killed where they stood, and another 10,000 were taken alive by the Parthians and marched east, in chains, toward a frontier so distant that Rome would never hear from them again. That should have been the end of the story, and for almost 2,000 years, it was. But then, in the late 1950s, a British historian sitting in an Oxford library noticed something strange in a Chinese chronicle from the 1st century before Christ, which described a battle on the eastern edge of the Han Empire against a foreign army that fought in a formation no Chinese soldier had ever encountered, a formation that locked shields together in overlapping rows, that moved as a single body, that was disciplined in a way only one civilization in the ancient world had ever been disciplined. And the historian began to wonder whether the lost legion of Carrhae had not, in fact, been lost at all. To understand how an entire Roman army came to disappear into the heart of Asia, you have to understand the man who led it there, because Marcus Licinius Crassus was not a soldier by inclination, but a businessman of extraordinary appetite, who had built the largest private fortune Rome had ever seen by buying burning houses from their panicked owners during city fires and then putting the fires out with his private brigade of slaves. He owned silver mines. He owned grain ships. He owned, by some estimates, nearly the entire residential property of central Rome. And in the year 60 before Christ, when he formed the political alliance now known as the First Triumvirate with Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, he was worth more than the annual budget of the Roman state itself. But money in Rome was not the same as glory. And glory, the kind that came from leading legions across foreign rivers and returning with chained kings behind your chariot, was the only currency Crassus had not yet purchased. Pompey had crushed the pirates. Caesar was carving Gaul into a Roman province. And Crassus, watching his rivals from his palace on the Palatine Hill, decided that he, too, would have his triumph, and that the place he would find it was beyond the eastern frontier, in the rich and ancient kingdom of the Parthians, who controlled the Silk Roads, who guarded the gates to Persia, and who, Crassus believed, would crumble before Roman discipline like every empire before them. He was wrong about almost everything. Crassus crossed the Euphrates in the spring of 53 with 7 full legions, 4,000 cavalry, and 4,000 light infantry, ignoring the warnings of his Armenian allies who begged him to march through the mountains where Parthian horsemen could not maneuver, and choosing instead the open desert near a small town called Carrhae, because the desert was faster, and because Crassus, 60 years old and impatient, wanted his triumph before the year was out. The Parthians met him with a force of 10,000 mounted archers and 1,000 armored cataphracts, and from the moment the two armies came within sight of each other, the battle that followed was less a battle than an execution. The Parthian archers did not charge. They circled. They rode at a distance the Romans could not close, and they fired their composite bows from horseback, with a pull strength that punched through Roman shields, and when Crassus's legions formed the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, locking their shields above their heads against the falling arrows, the cataphracts charged the immobilized columns and broke them open with lances. And then the arrows kept coming. Roman commanders had assumed the archers would run out of ammunition within the hour. They did not. The Parthians had organized a chain of camels carrying spare arrows behind their lines, and the firing did not stop, and it did not stop, and by the end of the afternoon the Roman dead lay in heaps that the surviving legionaries used as walls. Publius Crassus, the general's son, led a countercharge with the Gallic cavalry and was cut off and killed. The Parthians cut off his head and rode it back to the Roman line on the point of a spear, so that his father could see it before he died. Crassus himself died the next day, killed during a parley that may or may not have been a trap. The Parthians, according to one account, poured molten gold into his mouth as a final commentary on the appetite that had brought him there. 20,000 Romans died at Carrhae. 10,000 more were taken prisoner. And that is where, for almost every history book ever written about the Roman Republic, the story ends. But 10,000 men did not die at Carrhae. They were marched east. And what happened to them next is a story that would not begin to come together for almost 2,000 years. Roman prisoners of war in the ancient world were valuable property. They were trained, disciplined, and, in the case of legionaries, they were among the finest infantry the world had ever produced. The Parthians did not execute them. The Parthians, like every other ancient empire, used them, and the historian Pliny the Elder, writing about 100 years after Carrhae, recorded that the surviving Roman soldiers were sent to the eastern edge of the Parthian Empire to a frontier province called Margiana, near the modern city of Merv in present-day Turkmenistan, where they were settled as garrison troops to defend the Parthian border against incursions from the steppes. This much is established. This much we know. What happens next is where the records grow thin, and where the story passes out of Roman history entirely and into the records of a civilization that almost no Roman of the 1st century before Christ knew existed. Margiana sat at the very edge of the world the Mediterranean knew. Beyond it lay the steppe, and beyond the steppe lay the kingdoms of Central Asia, and beyond those kingdoms, though Rome did not yet know this name, lay the Han Empire of China, which was at that moment expanding westward in search of horses, in search of trade routes, in search of the silk markets that would one day connect the two empires through 5,000 miles of caravan road. And in the year 36 before Christ, exactly 17 years after the disaster at Carrhae, a Han general named Qin Tang led a Chinese army westward across that frontier to attack a rebel chieftain of the Xiongnu nomads who had built himself a fortress city near the Talas River, in what is today eastern Kazakhstan. The chieftain's name was Zhiji, and in the brief and brutal battle that followed, recorded in detail by Han court historians, the Chinese soldiers came face to face with something they had never seen before. The Chinese chronicle of the battle, preserved in the Hanshu, the official history of the Han Dynasty, describes the defenders of Zhiji's fortress in language that, when first read by a Roman historian almost 2,000 years later, produced the unmistakable sensation of recognition. The defenders, the chronicle says, were arranged in a formation in which the men stood close together, with their long shields locked side by side, in overlapping rows that resembled, in the chronicler's phrase, the scales of a fish. They were drilled in their movements. They advanced and retreated as a single body. They had constructed a double wooden palisade around the city in a way that no Central Asian people had ever built defenses, and the chronicler, who had no reason to invent any of this and no Roman frame of reference to draw on, was clearly struggling to describe a kind of military discipline that did not belong to his world. It belonged to Rome. The shield wall the chronicle describes is the testudo. The fish-scale formation is the standard Roman maniple in close order. The double palisade is the kind of fortification a Roman engineer would have built almost by reflex, and the discipline, the synchronized movement, the cohesion under pressure, was precisely the quality for which Roman legionaries were famous and for which no other army of the ancient world was famous in quite the same way. Qin Tang's forces took the city. The strange defenders fought hard, but they were outnumbered, and they were taken prisoner, 145 of them, according to the Chinese count, and they were resettled by the Han state in a military colony established for them on the empire's western frontier, in what is today Gansu province. The colony was given a name. It was called Liqian. And Liqian, in the Chinese language of the 1st century before Christ, was the standard term used in Han documents to refer to one specific foreign people. It meant Romans. In 1955, an Oxford classicist named Homer Hasenpflug-Dubs put all of this together, and the question that has haunted historians ever since is whether a small village still standing on a Chinese hillside, almost 20 centuries later, is the descendant of those men. The village exists. It is called Liqian, sometimes spelled Liqian or Zilai, and it sits in the foothills of the Qilian Mountains in northwestern China, about 200 miles east of the Mongolian border, and it is home to a few hundred people who, in a country of more than 1 billion ethnically Han Chinese, look very slightly but unmistakably different. Some of the villagers have green or blue eyes. Some have aquiline noses. Some have hair that is not black but a dark, copper-touched brown. None of these features is dramatic. They are subtle. They are the kind of features you might not notice in any single person, but that, when you walk through the village and look at face after face, slowly accumulate into something that does not match the surrounding region. And in 2007, a research team from Lanzhou University collected DNA samples from 63 of the villagers, and the results, when they came back, found that 56% of their genetic markers were of Caucasian, that is, European, origin, in a part of China where the local Chinese population shows almost none. The findings did not prove the Roman theory. But they did not refute it either. The villagers might be descended from any of several Western populations who passed through Central Asia during the Silk Road centuries, Greeks, Persians, Sogdians, even later Roman traders, and the DNA cannot distinguish between them with certainty. What the DNA shows is that someone European arrived at that hillside 2 millennia ago and stayed long enough to leave a mark in the blood of the people who live there now. And the Chinese chronicle from the year 36 before Christ describes 145 men, fighting in Roman formation, taken prisoner at the edge of the steppe, and resettled by an emperor on a frontier hillside that he named after the only word his language had for the people who built that kind of shield wall. Whether those two facts connect, whether the village is the legion, whether the blood is the soldiers, whether the men of Carrhae actually walked the 4,000 miles between the Euphrates and the Yellow River and lived to leave children behind, is a question no historian has been able to answer with certainty. But it is also a question no historian has been able to dismiss. Crassus, on the morning of the battle at Carrhae, is said to have looked at the desert sky and remarked that the day was hotter than he had expected, and that his soldiers were thirsty, and that the wells were too far behind. 2,000 years later, on a hillside 4,000 miles to the east, an old man with green eyes and a Chinese name tends a vegetable garden in a village that an emperor once named after the place his prisoners had come from. And in the British Museum, in a quiet room on the second floor, there sits a single Roman coin, found in the soil of Gansu province in 1987, dated to the reign of Caesar Augustus, and bearing on its obverse the head of a soldier who once swore an oath that no one alive remembers him for. Maybe the legion was lost. Or maybe it just kept walking. This has been Hidden History Vault. The past never stops speaking.